respond to the needs of the planet, respect the rights of people, and revitalize the United Nations, eloquently reflects the multiple challenges the world continues to face for the second year in a row as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. This pandemic has traumatized humanity by the magnitude of its multifaceted and multidimensional impact across the planet. It continues to wreak havoc, straining our health systems, our economies, our public finances, and even the functioning and security of our states, to name but a few. With more than 4.5 million dead and 220 million persons infected, as well as completely devastated economies around the world, developing countries in general, and those in Africa in particular, have been deeply impacted due to their structural vulnerabilities. Given the persistence of the pandemic and its devastating consequences, mobilization is required in order to amplify the response to the pandemic and sustainably support recovery efforts for the post-COVID-19 period. In this regard, I note with regret that the inequality in access to vaccines remains great. Rich countries have achieved immunization coverage above 50%, while most African countries are below 2%. According to the World Health Organization, of the more than 5 billion doses administered worldwide, only 2% have gone to Africa. Nothing could justify this imbalance, given the interdependence of our world and the need to eradicate the virus from the entire planet. In that context, it is incomprehensible, in fact unacceptable, that some countries are stockpiling surplus vaccines while others are in dire need of them. The virus knows no continents nor borders, to say nothing of nationality or social status. Unvaccinated countries and regions will be a source of spread of the virus and the emergence of new variants. In this regard, we welcome the repeated calls by the Secretary General of the United Nations and the Director General of the WHO to make the vaccine accessible to all. The salvation of all mankind depends on it. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, improving the prospects for post-COVID-19 economic recovery is closely linked to improving the health situation or the eradication of the virus and end of the pandemic. This expected economic recovery is also dependent on reducing the divide in all areas between the North and the South. Developing countries severely affected by COVID-19 are already facing various recurring obstacles, the collapse of the tourism sector, and so on. In addition, the least developed countries and landlocked developing countries, including Chad, are also affected by the non-fulfillment of commitments made under the 2030 Agenda and the Addis Ababa Program of Action in the area of official development assistance. Chad once again launches an urgent appeal to all our partners in the North to honor their commitments to vulnerable countries with a view to contributing in a sustainable manner to a better post-COVID-19 economic recovery and accelerating progress towards the SDGs in accordance with the noble ambition of the United Nations to leave no one behind by the 2030 deadline. In that light, Chad reiterates the call repeatedly made by the member countries of the G5 Sahel relating to the cancellation of the debt of these countries, which have been hard hit by terrorism and climate change, in addition to COVID-19 and widespread poverty. It should be recalled that the absence of prospects for young people in the Sahel pushes them into the trap of extremist ideologies and prompts them to pursue illegal migration to Europe with all the risks that this entails. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, as you are aware, following the tragic death of its president, the late Marshal Idriss Déby Itno, who fell on the field of honor on April 20th while combating mercenaries from Libya, Chad began a period of political transition. A transitional military council was set up to ensure the continuity of state functions and guarantee the security of the country, which is seriously threatened by heavily armed attackers plaguing the south of Libya. A broad-based government headed by a civilian prime minister was put in place on May 2nd, 2021, and it is working hard to meet the deadlines to complete the transition process. A roadmap for the transition was drawn up and adopted in July. It focuses around three main axes. One, strengthening security and defense. Two, organizing an inclusive dialogue and consolidating peace and national unity. And three, strengthening good governance and the rule of law. The implementation of this roadmap, the cost of which is estimated at nearly $1.3 billion, is beyond the reach of Chad alone and requires substantial support from our partners through an urgent mobilization of the necessary financial resources. In view of the enormous security, economic, financial, and health challenges facing the transitional government, Chad appeals to the international community for strong support. In the same vein, all the necessary arrangements have been made to hold an inclusive national dialogue, the modalities for the organization and conduct of which are currently being examined by a committee that has been set up for this purpose. In addition, for the sake of bringing all Chadians together, including armed groups, a special technical committee was established to facilitate the participation of political military forces in the inclusive national dialogue. In addition, following the broad and intensive consultations currently in progress, the National Transitional Council, which will assume the role of a provisional parliament, will be set up. The national reconciliation process is in any case well underway and is evolving at a pace that is appreciated both by national actors as well as by most of our partners. In this regard, it is my pleasure to note the return to the fold of several of our compatriots in exile and members of certain armed groups who are responding favorably to the policy of the outstretched hand of the government. I urge all of our brothers who are still outside their country to return without fear or hesitation. They will occupy their rightful place, and their invaluable contribution to the effort of national reconciliation and the building of our country is greatly desired and awaited. We will welcome them all with open arms. With this in mind, and aware of our duty before history and before the Chadian people, I would like to reassure this august assembly that nothing will undermine our commitment and our determination to conclude the current transition process. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, Chad, which shares more than 1,000 kilometers of common borders with Libya and is linked to this brotherly neighboring country by the ties of history, geography, and culture, even by blood ties, is suffering the full brunt of the consequences of the Libyan crisis in terms of the recurrent armed attacks launched from the south of that country. The most recent attack against Chad between April 11th and 29th and which caused the death of our former president, the late Idriss Déby Itno, was an unfortunate illustration of this, and not to mention the chronic insecurity and instability that has extended well beyond in the Sahel since 2012. It should be recalled in this regard that the UN Security Council, during its meeting held on April 29th at the request of its African members, established a direct link between the withdrawal of mercenaries and foreign fighters from Libya and the aforementioned tragic events in Chad. With this in mind, Chad expresses its deep concern at the strong pressure from the international community demanding an immediate departure of mercenaries, foreign fighters, and other irregular armed forces from Libya. Such a departure of Chadian nationals, recruited, trained, supervised, armed, and financed for the needs of the war in Libya, will not be without consequences for the security of Chad. That is why Chad once again urges the international community, and in particular the UN Security Council, to take all necessary measures for the establishment of a supervisory mechanism for a planned and coordinated departure of these elements. Chad is in favor of a disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration process for its nationals serving in Libyan factions who renounce violence and mercenary activity to return to their country. We are counting on the leadership and the crucial role of the United Nations in leading this process and mobilizing the resources necessary to finance it. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, we cannot talk about the Libyan crisis without addressing the gravity of the security situation in the Sahel and its environs. It is marked by the spread of terrorism, organized crime, and illicit trafficking in arms, drugs, and human beings. The increase in terrorist attacks against the armed forces of the G5 countries and the Lake Chad Basin countries, as well as the civilian populations in Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, illustrate the resilience of terrorist groups and their capacity to do harm. These groups seriously threaten the very existence of our states and jeopardize their development. The sacrifices made by the G5 Sahel Force and the National Joint Task Force against Boko Haram in the Lake Chad Basin have been enormous, but the danger persists and terrorists continue to wreak havoc, plunging innocent civilian populations into desolation and despair. In the face of this threat, which transcends borders and puts a serious strain on our individual capacities to react, we must review our response approaches and pool our efforts to better adapt responses to the changing context and challenges on the ground. The G5 Sahel countries are tackling this by mobilizing their meager military material and financial resources. Likewise, the response to the terrorist threat should integrate dimensions related to economic development, climate change, youth education, and access to basic social services by our populations. From this perspective, our countries affected by the scourge of terrorism, which is considered a threat to peace and security, have the right to count on the solidarity of the international community in a spirit of complementarity. We have no choice but to act together in the face of global challenges. Chad also underscores the imperative need for greater multifaceted support, both to the aforementioned joint forces and to their individual member states. To this end, Chad once again reiterates the appeal repeatedly launched by the Conference of the Heads of State of the G5 Sahel to the UN Security Council to grant the G5 Sahel Joint Force a mandate under Chapter 7 of the United Nations Charter in order to ensure its sustainable and funding. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, Chad reaffirms its position of principle regarding the reform of the United Nations, in particular its Security Council. This reform, which has been called for by Africa for a number of years, simply reflects the legitimate aspiration of more than 1,200,000,000 Africans. How can we ignore this persistent call from an entire continent that has been unjustly excluded from a body which claims to be representative of all humanity and justice and equity of all nations, which are dear founding values of the United Nations? And Chad reiterates its commitment to the African Common Position as expressed in the Eswatini Consensus and the Sirte Declaration. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, in conclusion, I would like to express to His Excellency Antonio Guterres, Secretary General of the United Nations, to his organization and to all its member states, as well as to the regional organizations present in this room, our sincere gratitude and our deep recognition for the solidarity and moral support shown towards Chad following the tragic and sudden passing of the former president, the late Idriss Déby Itno. And finally, in the name of the founding principles of the United Nations and in that of friendship between the peoples, Chad reiterates its call to lift the embargo unjustly imposed on Cuba, which is seriously harming this country. With that, I wish us every success in our work, and I thank you for your kind attention.
On behalf of the General Assembly, I would like to thank the President of the Transitional Military Council and President of the Republic of Chad for the statement delivered. And also for the introduction made by my sister, the Permanent Representative of Chad. Thank you very much. The Assembly will now hear an address by His Excellency Azali Assoumani, President of the Union of the Comoros. I request protocol to escort His Excellency. On behalf of the General Assembly, I have the honor to welcome to the United Nations His Excellency Mr. Azali Assoumani, President of the Union of the Comoros, and invite him to address the Assembly. Mr. President, you have the floor. Your Excellency, President of the General Assembly, Your Excellency, Secretary General of the United Nations, Majesties, Highnesses, Excellencies, distinguished representatives of countries and institutions, Assalamu alaikum. I would like first of all to express to the US authorities my warm and sincere thanks for the warm welcome that they have given us. And this happens every time we come to this beautiful city of New York to take part in this great annual gathering. And I would like to express our sincere sympathy to the American people who are remembering in this month of September 2021 the 20th commemoration of the cowardly attacks of September 2001. And I associate myself to the tribute paid to the victims of these barbaric acts. I would also like to join my voice to those of eminent personalities who have preceded me on this rostrum in order to express my warm congratulations to His Excellency Mr. Abdullah Shahid on his outstanding election to the presidency of this 76th regular session of the United Nations General Assembly. My delegation and myself are convinced that your human and professional qualities will ensure the success of the current session. Allow me also to take this opportunity to pay due tribute to your predecessor, His Excellency Mr. Volkan Bozkır, for the effectiveness in his leading of the 75th session and how he so aptly fulfilled his mission. And on behalf of my country and my delegation, I would like to express my sincere congratulations to His Excellency Mr. Antonio Guterres, Secretary General of the United Nations, congratulate him on his remarkable re-election for a new mandate. And I would also like to express to him our appreciation and recognition of his ongoing investment, as well as that of his entire team, to serve the United Nations, an organization which is facing challenges which make its action ever more difficult, but still indispensable. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, delegates, this 76th session of the General Assembly is being held at a particularly crucial time in the history of the world and our organization. It is being held at a time when the family of nations are deploying their best efforts to manage and overcome the COVID-19 pandemic and its variants, which for almost 2 years now have brought the people of the world to their knees. On behalf of my delegation, I would like to welcome the waves of beneficial solidarity which have made it possible to avoid the worst. Indeed, after the shock of the initial days and weeks, human solidarity established and laid the foundation for a fight which gradually has enabled us to regain the upper hand over events. In this regard, the Union of the Comoros welcomes the effective work of men and women, scholars, researchers, experts, and the laboratories for their investment in the research and production of vaccines against this virus, and which finally have managed to give the world hope. Of course, we cannot forget here the sacrifices made by these thousands of men and women, healthcare workers of all categories, who, on the front lines of this battle and at the risk of their own lives, have, in each of our countries, been able to find the courage and the strength to brave the storm posed by this lethal enemy. To all of you, to each and every one of them, bravo, and a huge thanks. Mr. President, honourable delegates, the COVID-19 pandemic has devastated the economies of the world and upended the balance created centuries ago by states, nations and peoples. And it has forced us to live in a different way. We have been living since November 29, the date when it first made its appearance in the world, through an unprecedented crisis, a real world war. The pandemic has slowed down our lives. It has further deepened the gap between rich and poor. It has accelerated inequality and has disturbed the equilibrium of our national economies. No country has been spared of this. The pandemic has also revealed the sheer scale of the technological divide existing between countries and has shown us the importance of the new information and communication technologies and the need to act urgently to reduce this divide. Also, the inequalities observed in access to vaccines underscore the need to act in order to firmly anchor the spirit of solidarity, and it recalls to us the overriding role of multilateralism. And that is why, all together, with stronger solidarity, which really has its place at the heart of multilateralism, it is in that spirit that we must act to rebuild the world and save the nations and peoples. It is by including the magnitude of this reality that we will succeed in the work of this 76th session of the General Assembly of the United Nations and those of other major international gatherings, particularly the upcoming World Food Summit, COP26, and the 5th United Nations Conference on the Least Developed Countries. The subject of our meeting touches on the reform of our organization, which represents the best that we have to offer to the world in our ongoing quest for lasting peace and security. This meeting offers us as well an opportunity to evaluate the performance of our organization with a view to guaranteeing a better representation of developing countries and particularly of those of the African continent, which, let's be reminded, include both areas of dynamic economic growth, but also of conflicts, sometimes bloody conflicts, which delay development and the well-being of our peoples. The community of nations that we represent has the duty to address these problems, because if they're not resolved, they will mean that our organization loses its credibility, particularly in matters related to sovereignty and territorial integrity of our states. And I am trying to hear on behalf of my government, the Comoran people, the rapid, just and fair solution to the issue of Palestine, a solution that will establish the right of the Palestinian people to have a sovereign state with East Jerusalem as its capital, living in harmony and in complete security and harmony with the State of Israel. And I understand the position of some brotherly nations in the Arab world who have renewed their relations with the State of Israel. It is up to the State of Israel to understand the import of these bold initiatives and to take account of them in everyone's interest. Moreover, and with a view to a lasting solution for the Moroccan Sahara, which is of great concern to my government, I would like to express here my encouragement for the efforts undertaken by the Kingdom of Morocco, and we hope that they will lead to a solution which will make it possible for this brotherly nation to recover its autonomy and territorial integrity over this Moroccan province. My government welcomes any initiative which will contribute to ensuring peace in the region and strongly encourages dialogue between two brotherly nations, namely the Kingdom of Morocco and the People's Democratic Republic of Algeria. And along the same lines with regard to sovereignty, the Union of the Comoros repeats its position for the need for the People's Republic of China to recover control over the Chinese province of Taiwan. With regard to the territorial dispute between France and the Comoros relating to the Comorian island of Mayotte, in recent years we have seen a willingness on the part of both parties, the Comoros and France, to build on what has been achieved in our common history, whilst maintaining a frank and constructive dialogue with a view to arriving peacefully at a lasting and respectful solution, one that respects international law and which is in the interests of both parties. The areas of tension which endanger peace in various parts of the world have become fertile ground for the outbreak of international terrorism in the Sahel, for example, and more recently in southern Africa and in the Indian Ocean area. We must not remain indifferent to these situations. The situation in Afghanistan is also of concern, and I would like to express the support of my country to the Afghan people in this crucial phase of their history. The recent unconstitutional changes that have taken place in a number of countries in Africa and throughout the world recall to us the overall necessity of thinking about innovative and lasting solutions which look beyond short-term geopolitical stakes. In order to build peace, security and stability in the world, we therefore need to have a strong consensus, and stress should be placed at all times on preventing conflicts, whilst at the same time supporting efforts to resolve crises as they emerge. Mr. President, honourable delegates, the principles and values of the United Nations today are centred on the Sustainable Development Goals, which each country has made its priority. They are an ideal platform for establishing our collective commitment and on which we can rely as we carry out our action in favour of development. And in this process, as was shown in the voluntary national report of my country, which we presented in 2020 to the high-level political forum, the Union of the Comoros is engaged on a path that will enable us to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals in all areas. The Emerging Comoros Plan 2030 is the national reference framework for this. Moreover, I would recall that at the time when we begin this meeting, according to research into these matters, entire regions are due to disappear, whereas others will be subject to an intensification of climate phenomena such as floods, intense droughts, fires, the erosion of coastline, or the acidification of the oceans. Consequences of the disastrous effects of the degradation of our environment. Although these phenomena do not spare any country or any region, we must stress that it is the small island developing states, the Comoros is part of this group, that is the most concerned and which requires greater attention on the part of the leaders that we represent here. Indeed, these states, as well as many others, are also facing other dangerous phenomena such as maritime piracy, human trafficking at sea, drug trafficking, illegal fishing, and the plundering of the sea's resources. My government joins all national and global initiatives to fight these barbaric acts mercilessly because they are a major threat to the security of our respective populations. And this is why I plan to reorient the strategy of our diplomacy in order to include the dimension of security in our geostrategic actions, particularly in the Mozambique Channel area and the southwest region of the Indian Ocean. This new vision requires the support of neighbouring countries and our partners in development, and it has become the basis for any thinking about the future in this part of the world, so that there can be a sustainable and blue managed economy. This represents immense and vital potential. Nationally, I'm convinced of the need for political stability. This is the guarantee for socio-economic development, and my government works tirelessly towards this goal. Political stability, national cohesion are something very cherished by my country because they govern all initiatives. Salvation resides in a peaceful society that is held together and is inclusive of all the layers that make up that society. False information on social media and sometimes through reliable and unofficial channels only have the objective of harming the peaceful climate in our islands and undermine efforts to see the birth of the Union of the Comoros. But it is with national cohesion in mind that halfway through my mandate I have decided to engage a national political dialogue which I hope will contribute to bringing together in a greater way the men and women of the Comoros Islands around essential goals, namely peace, security and national unity, which will make it possible to build on our efforts with a view to the socio-economic development of our country. And here I would like to thank the mission of South Africa, led by the Peace and Security Commissioner, who has just ended his stay in the Union of the Comoros a week ago and was able to meet with all stakeholders in this dialogue, listen to everybody, understand and appreciate respective positions and produce recommendations. Now it's up to all partners in involved in this dialogue to move forwards. And I am aware that our country needs all forces available in society to build on what we have achieved over the last 20 years in the area of human rights, democratic changes of government, and to progress with our development. Also, Comorians must be able to trust justice, because that is what guarantees their rights and their protection. The judicial services must be what defends the weakest and protect them with regard to their rights in the face of rising violence, particularly against women, children, and all vulnerable parts of society. These acts must be severely repressed, and that is why my government has established the Superior Magistrate Council, made up of judges with a lot of experience in this area, and they have adopted a revision of the penal code to include provisions aimed at improving and giving the country an adequate political and legal framework. Mr. President, on the social front, as everywhere else, COVID-19 has obliged us to give it priority. The Comoros has seen 2 waves, and the second showed itself to be more virulent. Nevertheless, the situation was managed. We avoided the worst, thanks to the measures taken by the authorities and supported in this by all of our partners, bi and multilateral partners, communities and civil society. And we'd like to thank all of them here from the bottom of our hearts. We have to say today that the Comoros is now in the green category, and that is because we've observed vigilance, particularly being an insular country, in order to avoid a new spread of this disease. To date, the second step of vaccination is terminated, and the third cohort of vaccination will soon begin, which will make it possible to achieve our goal of 80% of the target population vaccinated by the end of 2022. And considerable efforts are also being deployed by my government to assist the population on a daily basis, particularly to shelter them from the world food crisis, which we have seen as one of the consequences of the health situation brought about by COVID-19. Mr. President, the action of all partners to development of the Comoros is to be welcomed. With the United Nations system, the new framework plan for sustainable development that has just been signed for the next 5 years fully incorporates the priorities in the Emerging Comoros plan. All efforts combined together, and with our bi and multilateral partners, we must converge towards a major goal, which is the emergence of the country between now and 2030. In this regard, I would like to recall here the organisation of the Conference of Partners in Development of the Comoros in December 2019, which saw the participation of hundreds of bi and multilateral partners and the private sector. After that conference, France was kind enough to host. We were able to mobilize partners who showed their interest to assist in this plan, which today is the reference framework par excellence for development in our country. The strong presence of partners of the Comoros, as well as the importance of the announcements made, witness to the success of this historic meeting. Also, remember the close cooperation with countries with which we share a common destiny in the southwest of the Indian Ocean, and with whom we plan to implement common projects to strengthen significantly our links of good neighbourliness and cooperation for the well-being of our respective peoples. However, all of this effort unfortunately has been dampened by the COVID-19 pandemic, which has affected all countries, and when it comes to the Comoros, it has weakened the commitments that we took at the Paris conference. Today, reality is that we must say that we simply have to learn to live with this virus. Therefore, we have to find the way to advance on these projects that we previously agreed. And from this rostrum, I would like to launch a friendly and brotherly call to all of our partners that together we find the ways and means to move forward with the Paris commitments to fund the various projects that we have established for the Emerging Comoros Plan. The country has established an executive secretary to follow up on the Conference of Development Partners, which will work closely with national bodies involved in this process and also with all of our partners. Mr. President, honourable delegates, regionally the Union of the Comoros last May passed the presidency of the Commission of the Indian Ocean to France. We wish them every success in advancing the ideals and values that are so close to the hearts of the peoples of the Indian Ocean. With regard to our presidency, it was a success, and it progressed the organization, the sub-regional organization, bringing about a reform that made the organization more effective, more modern, and more able to respond to the expectations of our respective peoples. Following an initiative that we took in Moroni, the Comorian presidency also helped to successfully manage the COVID-19 pandemic in the member countries by establishing a regional plan for a blue economy and a strategy for relaunching regional economies. The Comoros participates also in regional efforts aimed at ensuring security in the East African area. Support is also given to the sisterly Republic of Mozambique in their fight against terrorism, a scourge which unfortunately spares no country. The regional and international solidarity must be the order of the day in order to fight mercilessly against this scourge and ensure our regional security. Also, the Union of the Comoros is very honoured to hold the Vice Presidency of the African Union, and we have committed ourselves to play an effective role to promote the noble values that are defended by this continental organization linked to peace, stability, and the respect for human rights, and the implementation of Agenda 2063 in all its aspects. The Comorian Vice Presidency of the African Union works closely with the Bureau of the organization, particularly in the search for peaceful solutions to the various differences that exist between the Arab Republic of Egypt, the Republic of Sudan, and the Republic of Ethiopia. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, we come here every year to the United Nations. This proves the interest that we attach to multilateralism and our conviction with regard to the major role played by this organization to make the world more humane. And in this regard, I would like to laud the speech delivered by His Excellency Joe Biden, President of the United States of America, for his commitment to multilateralism. Our presence here this year in the General Assembly translates, I think, a common determination, strong and unfailing, to work for the good of our respective peoples. We are here to say yes to all who will contribute to a better balance in the world and say no to those who would be against this. And particularly we are here to say no to COVID-19. I thank you.
En nombre de la Asamblea.
On behalf of the General